Oh, well, I'm Lee Allen Woodcock, L-E-E, Allen, A-L-A-N, Woodcock, W-O-O-D-C-O-C-K.
Okay, great. And how old were you during the 1964 flood?
I was 13 years of age.
Okay. And where did you live during 1964?
I lived in Alton, California. We actually lived in McDermott Street. Our address was 2810 McDermott Street. That's the front street, or the street that faces up the river.
So which river was that you lived on?
The Van Dusen River. And
so that storm that came in, people in Humboldt County, we're all used to these storms coming in, and
Yeah.
pretty much one year after another, you don't really pay a lot of attention. When did
Yeah.
you notice that you thought this was not your typical storm?
Well, actually, it had rained an untypical warm rain for the season, the 22nd of December, and the night of the 22nd of December, and the night of the into the early wee hours of the 23rd of December, and we had aroused them very, very early, on the 23rd of December, and Dad had gotten us all up, and we gotten up to look at the river, and wandered down the railroad grade to see how high the river was getting, and just as it was light enough to see the river, and you do various things. You live by the river. You put a stick out, and you look at how high the water is raising on your house. You mark things, and then you time it for how high it's raising in an hour. You make a second mark, and we decide, well, you should drive the cars to high ground right now and move those things that can be moved to higher ground before you can't. And we started moving things out at a very early hour. We made the mistake of deciding, well, things were only going to get so high, so a lot of things we put up which we thought were high enough, and felt that there would be no more than, say, 4 feet of water in our house, not 6 to 8 feet. So a lot of things were ruined because the things we put them on, like kitchen tables and kitchen countertops, were covered with water, and tables turned upside down, and things like that. So we could have saved a lot more material if we'd have just simply removed them from the properties when we had the chance to do so. We had our own water system, so you end up pulling the electric pump out and getting it to high ground, and just doing everything you can to move the clothing out of the closets before it's soaking in. The river water, when it's like that, is half mud, and it's pretty well ruined. It ruins your mother's muskrat coat and things you don't think about. Father's World War II officer's uniform, his officer's whites from World War II, and which he used to march in Memorial Day, and his dress blues and all that sort of thing. He was a Navy officer and a pilot and various things, and and he was a hunter, so we had to get the guns, the blunderbuss, things, to get those to higher ground. They would be all ruined and rusted, and the rototiller and the lawnmower to higher ground, and we went around to the neighbors that were less able than us, and our grandparents were our neighbors, but they were in Oregon and visiting my dad's brother, so we were responsible for moving out 2 households. And then I could tell this, well, we had marked these places where we were watching the water raise. And we realized we had been through the 55 flood, and it had stopped one step below coming into our house. So, but we realized that the rate the water was raising, and I could stop and tell a story. We were going out to this railroad grade, and Rudy Gillard, who took all the pictures that Greg Rumney now has, was out on the dike taking pictures of it, and the water started lapping over the dike. And when it just started to do that, and there's a picture in Greg's book where the water is lapping, but when it started to do that, it just started erasing the dike. It just started cutting it back. And Rudy just came running back to his Volkswagen, and all it had was reverse to go backwards. And he could just keep up with the dike being erased as Rudy backed up. It was just erased in front of him, and as he backed up to what's the 4-lane road there and got on it. And then that's the reason he ended up in Alton, because he drove like mad back to Alton, which it was higher ground. And then he ended up exiting through Highway 36 in Hydesville to get back to Fortuna, because there was once that dike broke, it filled Alton, and then it went right on down to Fortuna, and Clay Brown Mill and all the places, the river center. I mean, I believe if you see those pictures in that book, you'd have never built the river center on that low ground down there without building it on stilts like they do in Louisiana for a summer home. Well, anyway, that's that story. But after we saw that happen, we came running back to get more of our belongings out. And we met our neighbor, which is the story I told him. You wish me to tell that again? It's yes.
Yes.
We met our neighbor, Louis Van Duzer, who had trying out from Will Patton down here in Fortuna a brand new Oldsmobile, Delta 88 as I remember it. Anyway, it was an Oldsmobile 88. He had it in his garage, and the water was at that point coming up, say, a foot an hour. It was raising just tremendously, flooding Alton. And he had the jack, the brand new jack, which you put on the bumper to change the tires. And he was jacking one corner up and putting some blocks under that wheel, and then jacking another wheel up and putting some blocks. And he was going to jack this car up high enough to avoid the flood, because in those days they were gracious enough just to let you take a car over the weekend and keep it and see if you liked it, and then you could buy it. And he hadn't bought the car, he just brought it home over the weekend to try it out. And we had to give him the bad news that we couldn't jack it high enough, fast enough to beat this water raising. And but we helped him for a while. We jacked it up a couple feet, put boards. He had a lot of boards around there, but we told him, tell you what, you get everything you want to take out of your house, and we'll meet you with our boat at your front door. It was a big house. It's really the biggest house in Alton, and it's off the ground at least 4 feet, maybe 6 feet. And there's a big flight of stairs up to it, and banisters and stuff. And my dad's 14-foot boat was set and floating in the garage, almost to the ceiling of the garage. And we got in the boat. Well, I'm the kid. I get in the boat. And I unhooked the boat trailer from the boat, which is floating with the boat. And the boat trailer goes clunk down to the bottom of the garage. And we led the boat out of the garage, leaving the boat trailer in the garage. And we got it out there. We got the gas hooked up to the motor and got it started. And we went over to the neighbor's house. And the neighbor met us with his wife's well, clothes basket, which is a big wicker basket. And he'd gotten all of his gift Christmas liquor from underneath the Christmas tree, because that's what he wanted to take out. And during the flood, he just kind of gave up on everything, because he knew everything was going to be ruined, and the car is going to be ruined too, and he was pretty disgusted with it all. So here he comes with this big basket full of this liquor in these, square boxes with bows on the top, and crawled over the front of the boat, and we took him out to high ground, and he got in his Jeep, which was already parked on high ground, and motored up to his daughter's in Hydesville, and he didn't come back for a couple of weeks. So that was that. And we had a lot more trips to take back to my grandma's house, and it was flooded by then, had several feet of water in it, and we've had a chain of people helping us, and had a whole freezer full of frozen meat. They used to buy a half of beef at a time, and power was off and out, and then we started unloading all this frozen beef and throwing it one person after another, hand over hand over hand, and basically when we got all the beef unloaded, the freezer just floated around like a boat in the house, and all their furniture was floating around in the house until it got waterlogged and sank. And that wasn't take too long. The house had wall-to-wall wool carpet in it. The water was so dirty, I can go a little ahead of time until the water went down, and then that wool carpet shrank a foot. You know how a wool sweater shrinks, and pulled away from the walls, so that it no longer fit the room. Not that it was fit to use anyway, but it pulled the carpet tacks out and pulled away from the walls, and it was a horrible mess. And you couldn't burn it because it was wet, and it weighed about 1,000 pounds and took 10 men to haul out of the house. Anyway, the mud and mess that this flood left was horrific. Fortunately, our structures stayed intact. We were gracious enough to have a lot of support people that took in all our laundry, because most of our clothes got terribly dirty, and they did laundry for us and put it in cardboard boxes. My folks all their furniture was ruined. They couldn't, only way you could get the drawers open, everything was to pry the fronts off, and then you took the dirty stuff out of them and gave them to your friends to launder, and they gave them back to you in cardboard boxes. And we could afford one mattress for each person, which you threw on your, had hardwood floors like this in the house, and after they got wet, they rose up like a barrel. So the house's floors were like a drum. And then after a couple of months, they dried out enough, they laid back down. But it left a crack between each board that was about 1/4 of an inch wide. All the folks could afford to do was sand them and fill them with some paste wood filler stuff. Worst the thing out first with the fire department from Hydesville came around, and they just pumped that dirty old water in the house and pushed it out with squeegees and stuff. And you had sheetrock walls, so you had to be kind of careful with a fire hose. It'd just blow the walls out. And grandparents stayed up with Dad's brother for a month or two. Um, the streets were terrible. I guess we had a little garden tractor that my uncle took and took the engine apart, and I did a lot of pushing mud around out and for people so they could get back to their parking spot by their house because there was that much mud. There were dead cars parked everywhere because, there was that much mud on the seats in those things. People's barns were off cattywampus. I'd worked at this old West trading post down there as I'd helped the guy deliver stuff after school, and it moved forward and into the ditch, and that was Skeeter Green and Gene Green had that kind of a furniture store, used furniture store business. They had to kind of tear it apart and rebuild it. I didn't go back to school for 2 weeks. I helped clean up, and my teacher was a forward thinker, kind of an independent thinker. Derek Jeffrey Frederick Johnson. He was from New Zealand. He was a Battle of Britain pilot, interesting soul. I went to Humboldt State, got a teacher's credential because he lived with an aunt here. Gave me full credit for not missing a day. What else would you like to know about?
That was good stuff. Good stuff. How about the stores? Stuff in the stores. Was there much to?
Wasn't much selection for a long time, and you just had. I don't think my mother had much money to buy anything extra. I know we had Shasta soda pop. That was a big treat. Could never get Coca-Cola because that was like extra expensive stuff. We didn't, on payday we would get some Shasta brand, multiple flavored. And my dad would commute to work at Pacific Lumber Company over at Fernbridge and Blue Slide and all the way around over there. This was the old Pacific Lumber Company. They sent him a paycheck. Never went back to work for 6 weeks. They sent him a paycheck every 2 weeks. It's like he never went to work for 6 weeks.
Yeah. A different world in a lot of ways.
It was a different world. Yeah. Logging kind of caused some of those problems, but it was sort of a more booming time for the economy around here. It's like there were more options, less government. I don't know what to say. We had the aircraft carrier Bennington sitting over his office on the coast here, brought those helicopters here.
Did you see the Bennington?
Only at a distance, way off Eel River mouth. But it was so horrific to drive to Alton. We stayed here on Ronerville Road, or 4040 Ronerville Road, with George Woodcock, my dad's cousin, and drove down there every day. It took us 2 weeks to be able to move back in the house, to clean enough crud out of it, to make it possible to move back in. And and he had a dairy ranch here, and you every day you had to get a pass to go down that area because there was some looting went on. So anyway, they brought the National Guard out there. And so we had to get a pass. So, and the freeway was just just tore up. It's like, you wouldn't believe it, like holes. And it took all 4 lanes to drive to Alton from Fortuna because of the holes in the road. You went from side to side and around huge redwood logs, around houses in the road, around piles of gravel, and
the dairy ranch that was your cousin who had.
that was my dad's cousin.
Your dad's cousin. Did he lose any cattle? I know a lot of.
No, he was in Ronerville here, and he was high and dry. Interesting thing, he had 300 gallons of regular gasoline for his tractor, so that allowed us to have fuel to go down there. Because for a long time, gas was pretty short here. It was.
They were telling us that in Shively, before down at the store they were selling gas, and that when they knew the water was going to come up, they just had everybody go through and fill up their cars full of gas because they didn't want the gas breaking out and getting into the Eel River.
Yeah, all sorts of things like that. Or you just, you might as well give it away and let it go down the river. But for a while the power was out, and then the power was back on. But like Alton, PG&E just came and pulled the fuses like on the pole, so there was no power down there because everything was so underwater that they had to come down and, well, all the fuse boxes there was before they had circuit breakers were all full of mud, and then PG&E came around with a pressure washer and a truck full of water, and they pressure washed all the fuse boxes out of everybody's house and let them dry a few days, and then they turned the power back on so you could use the wall plugs. Actually, you can't believe the job. All your wall plugs are full of mud, and you got to take the switch plates off and wash them off. Water doesn't conduct electricity, but most people think it does. Salt water does, but fresh water doesn't. You got to wash them all off. It's quite a job to rejuvenate a house that's been flooded, and a one that's made with sheetrock interior like this house. That sheetrock stays soft for a while. You got to wait for the sheetrock to dry until it's firm enough. You can get in with and clean the floor for a while, but then you can't clean the walls until the sheetrock's dried enough that it'll stand some washing with a hose. And then you can go back and paint it and work with it. And then Father got these space heaters that looked like jet engines and put under the house, and burned a few 100 gallons of #1 diesel oil or kerosene to dry it underneath there. And then what's happened, you got pier blocks, and then the mud gets to the point that it covers your pier blocks that are cement. And that cement is what separates the dirt from the wood that's upright. And when you got those pier blocks covered, then you got contact from wood to dirt, and that's what gets the termites in the house. So you've got to get under there when it dries out next year with a little hand trowel and scrape all those off again, and to make your house without a route for the termites to eat it up. And it's a multi-year rejuvenation of someone who's small. I was smaller in those days. And then if you got ducts underneath the house with the heat system, all that insulation under there gets ruined. You got to re-insulate the pipes and on and on. And then you got to wait long enough until people don't remember the flood, and then the real estate value comes back on your house. Like it is now, because people don't remember. They say, oh, it's a 100-year flood. But if you've been through a flood, it's just yesterday's flood. Yeah, it's
I'm betting as a 13-year-old boy, you had a lot of work ahead of you. You were talking about those 2 weeks when you didn't go to school and you did work.
Yeah.
You just did a lot of work.
Just did a lot of work, yeah. Every other boy and father did. But it's hard to believe that people would come and steal your stuff. That's why they called the National Guard. They stood there with loaded guns, and if you dare go to those flood areas, they'd shoot you. And you had to get a pass every morning. And those were the days when, you know, fortunately I had 2 policemen. That was Randy Kemp and Dale Livingston. That was the whole police force. And I think maybe they had 1 car to ride in. It was cutbacks. And one of them would give you a pass, and you go down and show it to the guy. And they live, you know, like they had a barrel or 2, and they the Century had a barrel that he was keeping warm by, and a M1 over his shoulder, all loaded, and they'd look at your pass, and okay, you can go down there, and there was Centuries all along down in through there, and they weren't going to fool around with any looters. That was it. It's like nowadays, well, we'll have to study that. Well, we don't know if that's quite right. We might be violating somebody's civil rights by, you know, somebody might be camped down there. It's like in those days, it was like, if you don't belong there, we're not going to fool with you.
I think, you know, some of these things you have to make up the rules as you go along, because it's like, you know, nobody had dealt with anything of that magnitude till that point.
Nope.
So they kind of had to figure out, you know, how are we going to deal with this?
Yeah, they did.
One of the things people were telling us about was, like, after the flood, a lot of the stores, you know, it's something else that's kind of changed in the last 50 years, but stores actually extended credit to people who really had no collateral. I mean, they had pretty much gotten wiped out, but you know, some of the stores would let people buy on credit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, they had to. People didn't have any money. It was kind of a thing of the past they'd stopped doing because people had money for a long time. And, you know, early, you know, in the Westerns, they were giving credit, and they were back to giving credit. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of relationships with the store owners. You know, you knew these people, you'd known them for 20 years. You know, it wasn't like you had to fill out a form sort of thing. It was, you know.
My mother had this burn pile in the back of the yard where she was cleaning. She would be, I mean, forever cleaning out stuff that was ruined or it'd been ruined during the flood, but it'd sat around so long we hadn't got to it, it dried out again. And this thing would look like a volcano. It was burning for about a year. You know, like cushions off furniture that was no good. If you sat on them, you get up, your behind was, looked like you'd sat on in the mud, you know. It's like, so she had thrown on this burn pile and it'd smolder along there. And I had a collection of antique cartridges, you know, and it went through the flood. And a lot of them were old black powder, like 45 90s and 50 90s and 45 70s and real old cartridges and stuff, and I'd had them in an old shotgun packing, you know, those finger jointed things like the Remington shotgun shells had been packed in. That was like, you see them like well, like remake ones, but it was a real one. But I had my collection of old antique cartridges in there. It went through the flood, and finally, Mother got around to throwing that on the burn pile. And yeah, you can imagine what happened after those started cooking off. Every now and then there'd be boom. It wasn't real fast, and then every now and then another one would go boom, and Mother, darn you, I was going to clean those up. Do you have to throw those things on the burn pile too? And then there was flares she threw in there, and car flares, they'd light up and burn. And
that was an interesting burn pile. Thinking about some of the stuff you're talking about cleaning up the houses, and I'm thinking people were worried about mold, mold getting in because trying to get them dried out before that mold took hold.
Mold in the sheetrock, yeah. I think we didn't worry about that. We had enough problems to worry about. Sterilizing the well, like the well was totally full. It was a hand-dug well. It was like 40 inches in diameter, and I remember going down it on a line and looking at it. We poured about 8 gallons of Clorox down it and let it set for a week and see. And then pumped it until it didn't taste like Clorox anymore. Might have still had a little chicken shit taste to it, but it didn't taste like Clorox anymore. It's we were a lot happy to be home, and then there was the summer coming up, and you look at all the canned things, Mother canned a lot of stuff. You had all these perfectly good-looking pears and peaches, except they had like an inch of mud on top of them, and you could kind of like take a knife and kind of the mud off and run it under the faucet and go like, take a can over and hell, it still had a good seal. Well, hell, seems fine to me. Why don't we just eat it? So we ate some of them. And then some of them you go, well, I don't know, we ought to eat these. Maybe we ought to just throw them out. And Mother used to can everything in the finest mayonnaise jar she could find. She'd never buy those ball masons, because they cost a lot. And, guess we took our chances. I don't know what other precious stuff. My grandfather had bought a lot of wood home from Pacific Lumber Company because they gave it away during the '55 flood that was covered with mud. And he got it recovered in the '64 flood. And we never ever quite got that all used up. In fact, I left it there for the next person when I sold the house, and Joan and I got married, and I don't know if they've got it used up either. It was those fancy moldings that they were making to make awnings and various things, but it's anyway, it's got a double.
Were you using it for moldings?
Well, I wasn't using it fast enough because Grandfather got 2 or 3 people's lifetime supply of it. And, you see awnings and things made out of aluminum nowadays, but Pacific Lumber Company was making things like that out of redwood back in the old days when there were a lot of fine grain redwood. It would probably be quite valuable if you were downtown Los Angeles selling it right now, but I didn't get it all used up, and I let it go with the house when I sold the house. Anyway, And actually, the funny thing about it is that it was nothing. When we'd kind of done everything we could do down there, Dad got the boat out and just raced around the field out there. Just wound her up like a ski boat and just raced around a few laps just for the hell of it. And we latched on a couple big redwood logs and led them around the house and down 2nd Street so they'd go past it and wouldn't run into it. Came home for the evening and went back to look at things at 11 o'clock that night, and they were grim looking, and we were trying to light down on the house, and God, the water was just up to the tops of the windows, and you didn't know if the place was going to be there the next morning. We were all kids, we were all crying, and we came back up here by Wilburton Gulch and stayed over here with George Woodcock, and went back the next morning, and there wasn't a window broken in the house. Like a strange phenomena. Whole front fence was gone. Must have, the post must have been, it must have been just sitting there. It was a picket fence, like a real fine white picket fence, and it ended up on Mrs. Houck's front porch downstream, along with my grandpa's wood pile. And my mother had they called it a break front hutch. She was great for getting used furniture and not quite restoring it. So she'd have it out in the front yard and be stripping on it with some real nauseous stripper stuff you could buy back in the 60s. And then it rained, so she'd just take it and set it on grandfather's front porch, and you're going to get back to it, not quite. And that flood picked that thing up and took it out of that porch. His house was like what do they call that? It was a craftsman house. But off that front porch and down and across the railroad tracks and on to Win Houck's, well, you wouldn't know what house. That's a house across the tracks and down the old highway, which has a great big brick fence around it now. It didn't in those days, and all Grandpa's wood pile landed on his front porch. Mother's break front desk, partly restored. There it sat. And it's almost like, it was over there, it's like, I'm kind of like embarrassed that it's there. It's like, we had too much work to do to bother to go down there and get it. And it's like, I'm embarrassed at that load of wood. It's not a load of wood. It's like 3 cords of wood are on its front porch. And it's sitting right in front of all their fancy windows. And it's like, I don't know if some of them went through the windows. It's kind of like a lumber company that had a coal deck that went down the river and knocked somebody's house down. It's kind of like, I don't want to admit it was our wood.
You don't think about that whole, people have told us about in Ferndale, some of the wood that broke loose, and then, the timber company's hiring people to go and collect it all. But then you don't think about the individual people and like, oops, my wood pile's like,
yeah,
gone down
I'm
the
feeling
road.
like a lumber company.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things built around here out of lumber company wood. That's what the people that worked in the lumber companies, they built these washing machines, that they tried to wash the lumber and reuse it, and it was absolutely impossible. They couldn't do it. They didn't have the invention of carbide tip surfacing or planer heads. The knives that went in the planers were simply hard steel, and they couldn't run those boards that were full of silt through them because they dulled the knives too quick. The factories were running a 4-hour run on the planers and then changing heads, and those would dull the knives in an hour's running. So they made these washing machines that had all these things that had brushes and high pressure water. They had like a high pressure water, like a car wash, and then a rotary brush, but they just could not get that silt out of that wood to any satisfaction to keep from dulling those planer knives, which there were 10 knife heads. They had to pull those knives out and grind them every hour, and then they had to, and they're very expensive, and every time you grind them, you shorten them, and then when you put them in there, you have to run a stone through them while they're running, and that shortens them more, knock the back, and they tried to reprocess that wood, so they ended up giving it to the people whose property it landed on and knocked their fences down, and as a partial settlement and partial grief solution they recovered most of the logs that the people would allow them to recover them. Some people wouldn't allow them to recover them, but most of the people that were mill workers spent most of those months on the Lolita bottoms recovering material to run and rebuilding their mills. And of course the Pacific Lumber Company, all the electric motors and everything were ruined and had to be rewound, and bearings were all ruined, and that was that. I'm off the subject of Alton, but
it's one of those things that happens. Yeah.
Can I ask some questions about
Sure.
that? You know, Lee, you're right. Alton is right below the Rotorville Airport.
yes, it is.
So you were there. Sounds like you were there during those 2 weeks right following the flood. Do you remember a lot of air traffic from?
Oh
those
yes,
helicopters?
lots of air traffic. Yes.
Small planes, helicopters.
Small planes and helicopters, yes. And some of those caribous, those twin engines that hauled the hay out to the ranches and stuff, flew out of there. And I remember that spectacular semi-crash where they came out with a load of people in a Huey, and something was wrong with the rotor, and they came out and plopped right in front of our house in the mud from Rotorville, and everybody had to get out and walk in the mud and crawl through the barbed wire fence there and ask for assistance for a ride back to Rotorville because something was wrong with the helicopter. They didn't really know what, but it didn't sound right, and they were afraid they were going to lose something, power or a blade, or they thought that maybe they'd struck a bird or something with it. But I could tell you when those officers in their spit shine patent leather boots and their spotless flight outfit got out in that mud, and everybody else, it was like everybody out, or all ashore, it's going ashore, as I might say. We were living like rats, and little dirty rats, and Alton and crawling around the mud. I lived in hip boots and well, that picture of me, and I had a parka I wore all the time and was always crawling around the mud fixing something, and it was kind of revolting to them. They were suddenly grounded And I think they weren't going to get back in that helicopter in that same outfits they got out of it in.
Let me ask you another question about the ducks. We talked to Jeremiah Scott,
Yeah.
the lawyer in Eureka, that said
Yeah.
he was kind of in command of some of those ducks that came down and actually down to
They were there. Yeah.
So you saw them, and were they
Yeah.
rescuing people?
Not much. They didn't do much good for anything. They were all the way down as far as Eel River sawmills, but you know, those ducks didn't have enough power to swim against the current of the river. They were there early on and quickly got out of there, or they'd have been lost. They basically crossed. Alton's modified now. They've leveled that out. It used to dip. It used to go up across the double tracks, which tracks are gone now, and then it went down into a dip. And then there was a little bridge you turned into Alton, and then you went up across the second tracks, which go out to Carlotta, and they swam the duck across there, and then they tried to go down the old highway toward the Grove Auto Court, which is not there anymore, toward Nolan Trucking, which is not there, which is airtight stove there. The current was too much for it. It swirled around. They barely got it back up on the railroad grade. And they took it back up toward Hydesville. I can tell you another interesting phenomena there is Digger Odell, Dwight Odell. We used to call him Digger Odell, Digger's Weekly. That was the Humboldt Beacon, but everybody around here called it Digger's Weekly. He and some buddy of his came down in a genuine amphicar. You ever see one of those? That was one of those cars. It was a French car that could convert from a car to a boat. And it was another one of those things. That car didn't have enough power to go against the current of the, and they were going to go from Hydesville down through that dip, which it did fine. But then they went out like they were going to go to the freeway, and that car went like, whoa, going to go down the river. And they went like wide open to make a turn to come back to the railroad tracks and back up and through the dip into Alton and back up where they came from to Hydesville and back through Wolverton Gulch and back to Fortuna and write a harrowing story about Alton experience, probably in the Humboldt Beacon. I end up looking at him. I should be looking at you. But,
I haven't read all of the Humboldt Beacons from that time yet.
Well, I don't think he ever wrote about it. Anyway, J.D. Dwight Odell. Yeah.
I have another question I want to ask you. It's just for my own clarification about this dike. So there was a dike that kind of went from the railroad bridge kind of up.
It went all the way down. It curved out from the railroad bridge all the way down to where you would see it end right by the river center. It's the same dike.
So you're talking about the Sandy Prairie dike,
Yeah,
that dike.
it went all the way, but it broke on the upper end. And there's a very good picture in Greg's book of it breaking up there.
Yeah, I saw that in the paper too, but I was asking about a dike between Alton and the Van Dusen. There wasn't any dike in
No.
there. Okay, that's where I'm confused.
And actually what happened is the Van Dusen became so much river that it couldn't run under the railroad bridge anymore because the eel was so high. You see, the eel was so high that it just couldn't run under the bridge anymore. So between the eel being so high, it just filled up Alton because, and I almost think that there was some eel coming back under the bridge into Alton, but the Eel River being so high, it just like blocked Van Dusen coming anymore going in under that and back down. It just, I mean, it was raising approximately a foot an hour. And beyond that, we started working and stopped measuring it. It just, you could just see it coming. We were watching it really on the steps of the house, and then we started watching it on the floor of the house, and then I started watching it on the height of my boots while I'm walking on the floor of the house, and then I'm making sure it's not coming over the height of my boots as I'm handing stuff out of the house. And I know my dad's 14-foot boat would haul about a ton, 1,200, 1,400 pounds of stuff. We could fill 2 half-ton pickup trucks with more than they could carry with one load out of the boat. Took 2 pickup trucks down like that with one trip for that boat. And we emptied 4 houses. You know, all the Van Doozers wanted to pack. That was one, like Lewis, the man, he wanted to just take the booze in the basket, but his wife wanted more stuff than that. So we did take some more stuff. And they had a second story, so not all their belongings were ruined. They had their clothes and stuff on the second story. But they did lose furniture and stuff downstairs. And then where's our friends, the tollers that were behind us? We took some stuff out for them. And Allison had a gravel ramp where they loaded the railroad, and people drove their cars up on top of that thing to keep them high and dry. And there were piles of gravel people would take a run at with their car and just get the nose of them up there, save the engine. The trunk might get full of water, but you'd save the engine.
Boy, it's amazing that you lost nobody at all.
No, we didn't.
No,
and we had banty chickens, and they flew up on the roof and stayed there for the duration. And then we'd feed them. We'd go down there and we'd feed them every day. We had wet grain, didn't matter. Our grain got all wet. We'd just throw a handful of grain on the roof and they'd eat it. They lived up there for the whole time. Yeah. Took the cat with us and the dog. And they all seemed to understand. They all went back to live with us. And they all hunkered down. They just knew that we didn't have much to offer. And we had a Christmas tree with presents, and all those presents got wet and wrecked and ruined and fell apart. And there was no Christmas that year.
Did you do a Christmas dinner or anything like that year?
Well, at my the cousin's house, they have a Christmas dinner for us. But we didn't have no Christmas tree.
Hey Lee, there was a relatively famous picture in the newspapers of this little guy, maybe he was 11 or 12 years old, sitting in a boat looking pretty forlorn. Do you know who that was? Do you remember that picture at all?
In the paper.
It was in the Times Standard, or the Humboldt, I guess it was called the Humboldt Times. I just wondered if you knew that picture. It seemed like I've seen it multiple places, but I've been looking.
Gosh, that could be Ferndale, and it could be down.
I thought it was Alton. That's why I mentioned it. I thought it was Alton, but I'm just wondering.
If it was Alton, I might have known him.
Yeah, I don't think it's in Greg's book.
Like Craig's book, it's not in that other.
Anyway, I just wondered. That's just a small.
I might know. Might not know.
Yeah.
There was some people left real early and just left with a truck, pickup load of stuff, and left their stuff and just got out. Others kind of stayed there to get things up, and we stayed there to get things up, but we didn't get things high enough to save what we should have. And that was a mistake on our part because we'd only been through the 55 flood, and we had, like my dad pulled the pump out of the pump house, but he put it on the counter in the kitchen, and the water got to be about 4 feet over the counter in the kitchen, so we might as well left it in the pump house.
It's hard to imagine, like, what do you grab? You know, people talk about that, like fires coming, you know, and trying to, you know, and in that case, you probably have even less time because, you know, you find out there's a fire and you've got to look
much
around your
less
house
time.
and grab stuff.
Yeah, it's you know, yeah, you do. Fire would be a lot less time. We'd had a lot of experience living around the river and watching that river and seeing it come up and go down, and having water around the house many winters, and then you can see it go back down, and going up, and actually Alton could flood from the ditches from the hillside and along Highway 36. And it did chronically flood, and there was a grate in the ditch that went under the railroad, and many times we'd go up there with a pitchfork and clean the trash out of that grate and de-water Alton. So we'd had a lot of experience de-watering Alton, and when I got a little older, I got a wetsuit which I used to go abalone, and I was everybody's hero. I'd go up there and put that wetsuit on and get right in the ditch and throw all the junk out of that grate, and it'd be like you pulled the plug in a wash tub in there, and then it just suck all the water out of Alton, and it was great. But that 64 thing was overwhelming. How much water we all had to contend with. Wasn't anybody that wasn't affected terribly. It was, you know, some people live very crudely. I mean, they just shoveled their house out with a barn shovel, and there was a pile on the front door step, each side of the front door. It looked like a volcano. They just shoveled the mud out of their house, and must have bought some new used furniture, and went back to living in it, and that was considered restoration. And they didn't even smooth the pile out, so your quality of restoration down there varied a great deal. And the Club Cafe, which was a rough and tumble bar down there, that was one of those that they did that kind of restoration on. They shoveled that thing out, and I don't know, maybe they got the Hydesville Fire Department would come around with a tank load of water and carefully hose the places out for you. And I think they had that thing up and running in 2 weeks or less, and we're back in business. We were little kids. We used to go sit on the railroad tracks and watch the fights down there. That was one of our entertainments. It doesn't have to do with the flood, of course.
I noticed you're not living any low ground right now. You're kind of up on.
You're right. I don't live on any low ground anymore.
Nobody we have interviewed lives on low ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how that works.
Funny how that works.
Besides that, Lee, is there any other major life lesson you think you gained from the '64 flood that affects who you are today?
Yeah, what? Don't buy low ground.
No, what other than that?
Well, I could tell you that there's excellent life lesson. Well, I think a person can be happy with less. I think that 64 flood brought us together as a family. You know, it's like,
Got to live with your cousin,
yeah,
your dad's cousin.
my dad's cousin over here. It was just, and you know, it's like, you know, there's a lot of people helped us. You know, I just mentioned that. My father was always involved with the Odd Fellows Lodge. You know, his father and he were in the Odd Fellows Lodge, and that fraternal order really pitched in to help a lot. And he was in the VFW. And they gave us clothes and stuff. They were used. They brought a bunch of them up. And you could go down to the Veterans Hall and pick out what fit and wear it. And of course, you know, we were kids and you were all picky about style and stuff. You know, you can't wear somebody's this and that. But you could get a coat to wear around, didn't matter, around out and down the river bar. I lived in the river bar, except for after the flood. It was so soft you couldn't even walk down there. But I guess, you know, you can work together.